Our second speaker is Professor John Dunne, who is a member of the Department of Religion at Emory University, a co-director of Emory's Collaborative for Contemplative Studies, and an affiliate of the Mind and Life Institute. Professor Dunne's research focuses on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, especially in India and Tibet. His current research focuses in particular on the concept of mindfulness in both theoretical and practical contexts. Professor Dunne has published widely in such diverse places as the Journal of Indian Philosophy, Trends in Cognitive Science, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Professor Dunne is the author of Foundations of Dharmakirti's Philosophy, which appeared in 2004 with Wisdom Publications of Boston. The title of Professor Dunne's talk today is The Impact of How It Feels, Neurophenomenology and the Cognitive Science of Religion.
Thank you, Bob. I think we're going to be putting up my presentation now, so I will not be seeing myself as I speak to you. This is where it would really be a great advantage to be a kabuki player, so that I could look at my audience here and look at you folks simultaneously. But I'm afraid that's not going to work out. I'll do my best to balance a bit, but if I'm looking about over there in Oxford, that's why. I want to thank the organizers of this event. I'm happy to participate in this grand experiment, which I think has gone quite well so far. And part of what I'd like to talk to you about right now is actually, in a sense, another grand experiment, a certain type of research program that I've been involved with a number of colleagues, especially at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but also developing here at Emory University since my arrival in 2005. The one way of thinking about this issue, or at least the way I articulate it for myself, is really the question of what does experience do to the mind and body? What is more specifically, what does the phenomenal feel of a religious experience do? Is it crucial to understanding how it can have a profound impact on the human organism? And what I mean by phenomenal feel here is this sense of what it's like. I'm specifically referring to the notion in phenomenology that there are background aspects of experience that are crucial to the different modalities of experience, and that these different modalities of experience expressed through the background are especially important in the context of religious experience. And when I speak about impact on the human organism, I mean both mind and body. In this context also, recently I've come to believe that affect and not belief may be of particular importance in understanding this notion of impact. In other words, it's not the contents of our cognitive experiences, but the affective way in which they are presented, which may be especially relevant for understanding religious experience. And an implication for me in a larger project that I'm trying to articulate now, even as we speak, is the notion that the impact of religious experience may play an especially central role in constraining and reinforcing particular cognitive models and frameworks of a given religious tradition. I won't be able to speak about this in detail, but the model that I'm currently using is one based on conceptual blending, a cognitive model developed by Fauconnier and Turner. And I'm especially interested in the way in which religious practices, religious experiences may have a very strong impact on simulation and the role of simulation in cognition. Another way of articulating this is to ask, how can religious or quasi-religious contexts inculcate beliefs, especially those that motivate action, which are not explicable through innate features of human cognition? Now, this brings up, I think, a really crucial way of trying to investigate this issue. And it begins with the notion that consciousness itself can correlate to a complex dynamical system in the brain. As you will see, some of this is speculative, some of this is based on very initial research, but there's a particular way of approaching cognition in contemporary neuroscience in which complex dynamical systems are used to model cognitive acts. The theory here is that affect tracks the efficacy of downward causation. And the method to be employed will be neurophenomenology. Some results that I'll discuss are studies that I've been involved in meditation and Buddhist adepts. And then I'll return very briefly to the implication, that is to say, limits on the way we think. Now, just to draw a couple of contrasts before we move into the actual subject matter here, you can think of some work in cognitive science of religion, even some of what Dr. Cohen presented today, as asking what features innate to human cognition might explain the ubiquity of religious beliefs, such as beliefs in supernatural agents. Dr. Barrett's work, Dr. Cohen's work have been very useful in this regard for myself as well. But I think another question that we can ask is what features of lived religion might help us to understand the way that human cognition can develop and be transformed over the course of the entire lifetime. In other words, how is it that lived religion, how is it that what we might call religious experience can have an impact in a way that transforms the individual, so that we're not simply asking what is already innate to humans that enables us to see certain features of, to understand certain features of religion, but how certain features of religion actually can change humans. Now, when we talk about modeling the impact of experience, the overall question here in neuroscience, as I understand it, is that if we accept alterations in cognitions, affect and behavior correlate with alterations in brain functioning, then we need a model to explain how those experiences can actually alter the brain physically. And this is the very basic notion of neuroplasticity. I should step back here and note that, of course, I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm relying to a certain extent on my neuroscientific colleagues. All of this is being filtered through my stance in this project as a person who is informing the scientists about the nature of certain types of practices, who's dealing with methodological issues, and who's also trying to articulate some of this in phenomenological or philosophical terms. My understanding of neuroplasticity is based on those explanations, and even on a very accessible work by Begley in 2007 that I would recommend to you if you would like a layman's introduction to some features of neuroplasticity. The basic point here is not a controversial one. It's the notion that experience actually alters the brain. Now, a larger question here is how some experiences might alter the brain more profoundly. Is there a way in which religious traditions in general tend to harness some feature of experience or employ certain types of techniques that have a more profound impact on the individual than other types of experiences? Is this something that has developed over the centuries of human civilization in such a way that religious traditions have more or less developed a technology of human transformation, or if you like, human control? Now, the model that I mentioned here is one in which consciousness is going to correlate to a complex dynamical system. In brief, what we mean here is that conscious events are not best understood as correlating with isolated activation of individual brain structures operating through linear causality to produce local effects. In other words, it's not the case that we can find a little piece of the brain, if you will, a particular region or a particular structure, which is the conscious part of the brain, but rather that consciousness is going to occur across brain regions. In other words, it likely correlates with a large distributed array of neuronal activation across brain regions whose adaptive and stochastic coordination can be modeled through complex dynamical system theory. And all this means is that this kind of an array is not something that's going to be reducible to its individual components. Instead, it is acting as a system in which the components participate, but are not determined, do not themselves determine the system. In fact, the components act to a certain degree stochastically or randomly. Now, some relevant features for the particular version of a complex dynamical system that I'm talking about here are, first of all, that it's emergent. That means that the properties of this emergent system, this large dynamical system, this array of activated parts of the brain forming a system, is that that emergent system has properties that occur at the system level which are not present in the component level. An important point here to make, often in the context of emergence, we ask whether or not the emergent entity, which in this case would be a distributed array of neuronal activation, whether the emergent entity exists, whether it is simply, or whether it is simply a heuristic device. From my point of view, actually, this is not particularly relevant. It does not matter whether or not the emergent entity has some kind of independent ontological status, or whether it is simply a heuristic. This kind of a complex dynamical system is also complex. Part of what that means is that it's metastable. And I would direct here, particularly, you'll see the note at the bottom of this slide, I would especially recommend Evan Thompson's book that I'm going to talk about momentarily in 2007 for some very cogent and concise descriptions of metastability in a complex dynamical system. In brief, what we mean by metastability is that the system-level behaviors require stochastic processes. They require randomness at the component level. And thus, part of what this means is that the behavior of the system is neither fully random nor fully predictable. And this is part of the reason for the development, as I understand it, of this form of mathematical analysis, actually beginning in the 19th century, which is that this is an attempt to describe or to predict the behavior of a system that is not fully predictable or deterministically predictable. Another feature of this system is that it's adaptive, especially the kind of complex dynamic system that we're talking about is adaptive. It responds through its own internal dynamics to external and internal perturbations. In other words, when the system encounters some kind of change, let's say an external force, let's say you have a sensory input, the way in which that dynamic array responds is going to maintain the metastability of the system without losing its coherence. This also, on this particular model, means that the system is autonomous. And two features of autonomy are relevant. That first of all, it's linked to the environment, but behavior is not determined by environmental inputs. Now, part of what this means is that this way of modeling brain activity as a correlation possibly of cognitive activity or even consciousness is not really computational. It does not look at the brain as being like an adding machine, especially not an analog adding machine, but rather the behavior and the way in which cognition operates is going to be more complex in the way that's been described. Another feature of autonomy is that it's self-organizing, which is to say that it is not only adaptive, but that it retains its coherence when the proper parameters are in place without any kind of top-down control. There is no controlling unit that makes the brain behave in this fashion, according to this theory. Now, one of the examples of a complex dynamical system that appears in a short piece in Nature in 2002, and if you see the website at the bottom of the screen, you get a very entertaining, full-blown simulation of the Mexican wave. The Mexican wave is an example of a kind of very simple complex dynamical system, probably not one that we would call autonomous, in which the wave itself is not dependent upon deterministic actions of its elements. The persons in the stadium will vary in the way they stand up. Some of them will not stand up. Some of them will stand up more quickly and less quickly, and these are not fully predictable. However, the wave does exhibit a kind of behavior at the level of the system, which, within certain parameters, is predictable. And again, I really highly recommend the animation. If you'd like to spend 20 or 30 minutes making Mexican waves on the internet, you might find it entertaining. Now, another notion of, another way of speaking about the type of system we're dealing with here is that it is emergent. This is from Seal in an article and one of the areas, by the way, in which complex dynamic systems theory has caught on quite a bit is actually in business modeling, interestingly enough, organizational modeling. And this is Seal's article in that context on culture and complexity. You'll see here that, first of all, in frame A, you start with a set of components. In frame B, they begin to interact. In frame C, their interaction produces an emergent entity, which then enters into a relationship of what's called reciprocal causation. The emergent entity emerges as a result of the causal behavior of the components. But then the emergent entity itself, by virtue of its emergence, begins to constrain the causal behavior of those components. The components fall into states that are compatible with that emergent entity, if it is indeed a dynamical system with the metastability that we're talking about. Now, we take all of this and we're going to try to apply it to the brain. This is the way in which my colleague Antoine Lutz will articulate it very simply in the context of the brain. What we observe is that when one engages in a cognitive act, the various forms of brain measurement, imaging, EEG, fMRI, and so on, indicate that various regions become active. We also see that this activity among the brain regions on certain types of modeling can be said to be coordinated. And this coordination is based, the working hypothesis to explain this coordination that is observed under certain types of modeling is that it's a transitory formation of a synchronous distributed neuronal assembly. In other words, that different parts of the brain working together form this kind of a complex dynamical system. Now, this type of complex, all of this goes to say that I realize that this is a lot of gobbledygook for some of you, perhaps. And if you presented me, it's been a very long time since I did this type of mathematics. So if you gave me an equation to solve in complex dynamic systems, I think I'd be in trouble, to be honest with you. The reason for all, there is actually a reason for talking about complex dynamical systems here, because what we're looking for is a model that helps us to explain the way in which experience might actually alter the mind and the body. And alteration in mind and body here is, we're speaking specifically of neuroplasticity, although of course there can be, and there has been demonstrated, alteration in the periphery, for example in the immune system. So the key feature, the most relevant feature of this type of system that's of interest here is what we call reciprocal causation. There is upward causation, that we observe this in the figure that was presented by Seal, the 4 panels. That is to say that the local activity of components produces the emergent global system. But then there's also downward causation, which means that system-level effects emerging from the activity of the components actually constrain or alter the behavior of those components. One way of thinking about downward causation is in a weak form. So weak downward causation simply means that the self-organizing features of the system constrains the components in such a way that their causal behavior is restricted. If we think of this in terms of the brain, that means that local neuronal groups are inhibited from engaging in certain types of behaviors. It doesn't direct any particular behavior, but rather it simply prevents or inhibits or constrains certain types of causal behaviors that are not compatible with the metastability of that system or of that distributed neuronal array. And this kind of weak downward causation, an example of that is in what are called Rayleigh-Bénard cells in fluid dynamics. And these kinds of cells are formed by upward convection currents. And this is a picture from the NOAA website. And this particular example of Rayleigh-Bénard cells employs small aluminum filings in a fluid medium that's then placed between 2 panels and gently heated. And the upward convection of the heat creates these cells. You can even see it on occasion in your own frying pan in the kitchen, actually. Now, this is said to be an example of a kind of complex dynamical system. It has certain types of parameters that must be in place in order for the system to come online. So likewise with the brain, a distributed neuronal assembly has to have certain types of behaviors occurring locally in order for that assembly to emerge. And we can think of the Rayleigh-Bénard cells as an example of a kind of weak causation, weak downward causation. Once that system is formed, the shapes that we see, these hexagonal shapes that we see, correspond to the flow of the molecules in the fluid. Those molecules are constrained in their causal interactions with each other. They are going to continue, as long as the proper parameters are maintained, they're going to continue to exhibit this kind of flow, this kind of causal behavior. So what we have here is a kind of causation as constraint. And often when you hear the term downward causation in the context of emergence or a complex dynamical system, this is all that is meant, which is not really much causation, if you think about it. That doesn't sound much like causation to me. It's simply a constraint on the causal behavior of local components. However, we can also move to something that really is a stronger version of causation. And this means that the particular state of the system is actually an attractor for the behavior of local groups, causing them to fall into particular behaviors, favoring certain behaviors, other behaviors, and even possibly recruiting new groups. Now, this would depend, and again, I cannot speak to the mathematics on this, but the theory here, which is speculative in certain regards, especially in the context of a distributed neuronal array in the brain, this theory basically the distinction here is going to be between certain types of dynamic systems that are capable of weak causation, and which probably have to exhibit weak causation in order for them to remain coherent, and others that have other properties that permit some kind of strong causation, such as that the system is actually able to recruit new components. This theory is one that enables us to speak about some interesting experimental evidence. It's the theory that's being used currently to by my colleague Evan Thompson, for example, and Antoine Lutz, to explain some interesting experimental evidence in the context of epilepsy, which is that some simple cognitive task, for example, performing a somewhat complex mathematical task, actually alters the course of an epileptic seizure. And you can look at the results of this, the most recent interesting study that used a neurophenomenological method by Levanquoyen and Petit-Mangin in 2002. But actually, this same kind of effect is observed in much older material from 1954, and some of this research has been collated by Schmid-Schonbahn in 1998. Now, the claim here is that the effects that are observed in epileptic seizures on their time course, on the patterns of the seizure that are exhibited in fMRI and also in EEG, that the patterns and so on that are affected by the cognitive task itself. And this suggests that engaging in a conscious task actually alters the brain dynamics, because in a sense what we have are competing systems. One is the dysfunctional array that arises in an epileptic seizure, and the other is the array that arises as a correlate of engaging in a conscious task. Now, all of this speaks then to the possibility, so far what we have in terms of a model is the notion that there's a feature of, we're interested in the question, can certain types of experience, perhaps especially those that are induced through religious practices that are commonly found even in religious contexts. I would think, of course, of contemplative practices, and here I would include even practice of possession. Can certain types of practices actually have a profound effect on the human organism, on the mind and body of the human, independent of their cognitive content? In other words, that the practices themselves alter the person. And the model that we have here so far is a model in which the particular type of alteration we're speaking about is alteration in brain structures or neuroplasticity, changes in density of brain matter, and so on. And the theory here is that what we're looking for is a kind of state whose intensity, and I'll explain the concept of intensity in a little while, whose intensity somehow corresponds to properties of the distributed system, such that that system can exhibit the kind of downward causation that would lead to neuroplasticity. So that's the sort of overall research program. My neuroscientist friends would probably hesitate to articulate it in quite as bald terms in public, I think, in part because it remains speculative. But this is, in fact, to my mind, the implication of what's known as the enactive approach to cognitive science and to the modeling of consciousness and cognition. Of particular importance, on my view, is actually the role of affect. So what I'd like to propose, and what I'm proposing to my colleagues, is that there are certain phenomenal features, such as intensity, which again I will explain, that correlate with features of the dynamical distributed neuronal assembly that account for its causal impact. Now, when we talk about intensity, one feature of intensity can simply be a subjective account of how clear the experience is to one. Another way of talking about intensity can occur along various scales, would be the general intensity of the emotional feeling of the experience. We're going to explain a little bit more about how one might come to these measures. Now again, these phenomenal features, on my view, are primarily affective and not cognitive. And here in affect, I probably would not include most features of intention, although I would include interest, for example. I think, however, that most features of attention, such as selection, are actually not relevant, that most of these features probably have to do phenomenally, not with the phenomenal foreground, in which attention, as a selection rather as a feature of attention would be involved, but rather they have to do with the background. Now, if we add an additional proposal here, go a little further out on a limb, we can say that intensity and perhaps the genre of experiences regularly induced in religious contexts can have profound effects on the development, regulation, and transformation of human cognition and affect. And part of what we could say then is that historically in human culture, religious traditions of various kinds have hit upon the practices, the techniques, the social contexts that induce these types of experiences, and that they therefore have played historically a very profound role in human development over the course of the lifetime, not simply in childhood, but over the course of the lifetime. This means that, of course, religion is a means of transforming persons, transforming them perhaps even out of their innate assumptions about agency and so on, which is a feature of Buddhist practice, but also perhaps less salubriously, I suppose, a potential for controlling persons. Now, the mechanism of these effects involves a downward causation that we've described from an emergent process whose properties correlate with salient and phenomenally reportable features of conscious experience. So in other words, the proposal here, the proposal that is to some extent driving implicitly a current research program, and that may emerge as a more explicit motivation for a research program, is that we can track the capacities of an emergent system in terms of its downward causation through the phenomenally reportable features of conscious experience. The problem with this currently is that neuroscience, this is the implication of certain ways of modeling cognition and consciousness, but neuroscience still lags behind the capacity to model this at a sufficient level of resolution. That doesn't mean to say that one cannot begin, and indeed work in this direction has begun. Work that I would characterize as being in this direction has begun, but this is not a short-term program. So what we need to do is start with the manageable. And to start with the manageable, we can say by examining the phenomenally reportable effects of specific states induced by a contemplative practice in a controlled manner, we can make initial headway in testing this much larger and longer-term hypothesis. That means that we need a method, and the method is neurophenomenology. Now, neurophenomenology is the brainchild of the late Francisco Varela. He was an influential cognitive neuroscientist who was a co-author of the work, The Embodied Mind, along with Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche. And in The Embodied Mind, he was reacting to what are largely computational approaches to cognition and consciousness. We're really primarily cognition. No one would dare to speak of consciousness at that time. That approach is one that involves modeling cognitive acts through complex dynamical systems, and it also involves neurophenomenology. Part of this also grew out of his own experience with contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, and his interaction with contemplatives who seemed to have very strong phenomenological insights that matched his own understanding from the study of the Western phenomenological tradition. And this is part of what motivated him to be one of the co-founders of the Mind and Life Institute, which has been a major funder, or perhaps better to say a coordinator of funding and an initiator of research in this area. The second volume, you could say, the follow-up work to The Embodied Mind is this book, Mind and Life, which originally was meant to be co-authored by Thompson and Varela. Unfortunately, after Varela's death, Thompson did not feel that he had sufficient material in order to make it a truly co-authored work, and so it took him a number of years to rewrite the work. I highly recommend it. Thompson, who is a philosopher at the University of Toronto, is in many ways the standard bearer, in a humble way, for the enactive approach, both within cognitive neuroscience and in philosophy. Now, the neurophenomenological approach, developed initially by Varela and then articulated further by Thompson and his colleague and my colleague Antoine Lutz, begins with the notion of gathering phenomenally reliable data in conjunction with neuroimaging. That question of phenomenal reliability is an important one we'll discuss briefly. One then seeks correlations between phenomenological features and dynamical neurosignatures. The way in which this data is going to be gathered is not going to simply begin without a hypothesis. Actually, this step is the one that starts it all right from the get-go. And the data is not simply a fishing exhibition. Very often the data is going to be gathered in conjunction with some kind of behavioral task. But once one has a set of correlations, one then develops and tests hypotheses and then repeats as needed. This is a familiar process, I'm sure, to any experimental psychologist. Schematically, Thompson will represent neurophenomenology in this fashion. Part of the notion here is that there are mutual constraints on what we can speak of as the first person and the third person data in the experiment. The first person data is the careful accounts that are given through careful and phenomenologically structured accounts that are given by the subject of the experiment, accounts of their own experience. Experiences which are emergent from the cognitive affective processes of the brain itself. That's the theory. And those same cognitive affective processes are going to be manifest in neural correlates through some kind of neural activity, which here is going to be modeled on the assumption of some kind of, which actually is more than assumption, what seems to be the experimentally verified notion that these involved long-distance distributed networks. These activities, this neural activity is then modeled through complex dynamic systems and on the basis of data that is recovered through functional brain recording. So the notion here is that the data, the brain imaging data and the phenomenological data, the first person data and the third person data, in some way or another constrain each other. And they also can lead to further constraints in that process of experimental design and development of hypotheses. Antoine Lutz will schematically represent this same notion of neurophenomenology in this manner, that there are mutual or reciprocal constraints between the phenomenological clusters that are gathered systematically from the subject during the experiment and the dynamical neural signatures that are gathered through the imaging. Now, the question of phenomenological reliability, I won't go into great detail, but one way of dealing with this problem is actually to front load phenomenological distinctions into the experimental design itself. And without describing it, I'll simply direct you to the article by Lutz in 2002, which is also described in Zahavi and Gallagher's excellent recent work, introductory work on phenomenology. Another method is to train subjects and employ a second-person method for intersubjective correlation. And this is a project at the Centre de Recherche en Épistémologie Appliquée at CNRS that's being led especially by Michel Pitbull and Claire Petit-Mongin, in which they're developing a highly detailed phenomenological method for trying to not only train subjects, but also use this second-person interview method to gather what seem to be highly correlated results. And another method is to use highly trained subjects who are already trained in a type of phenomenological method, such as Buddhist adepts. And this is the method that's been used in some recent work, and it has the additional advantage from my standpoint of trying to raise some of these questions about religious technologies that induce certain types of high-impact experiences. When we think in terms of correlations, it's important not to have tunnel vision. It's important to be modest. And if subjects are sufficiently trained, it's important, if possible, to recruit them into the process of experimental design. Ideally, they should become collaborators. And this is, of course, part of what has begun in recent work starting in around 2001 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Contemplative practitioners have become collaborators in this type of work. When they do so, however, it's very important to bracket metaphysical assumptions on both sides. Materialist assumptions, physicalist assumptions do not need to be abandoned, but they do need to be bracketed. Assumptions about the long-term effects of these practices, the possibility of some kind of spiritual emancipation as a result of the practices also needs to be, such assumptions also need to be bracketed. But this does lead to another way to examine whether religion is an especially powerful context for human development and transformation. So I'm going to conclude in the last few minutes with some results about meditation in this regard in Buddhist adepts, and gesture toward a longer-term project concerning the limits on the way we think. Here we see Mathieu Ricard, who was one of the instrumental subjects here in this series of studies on Buddhist adepts. He's actually a Frenchman who earned a degree, a PhD in microbiology, but then went on to become a monk, wrote a famous book with his father, Jean-Jacques Revel, called The Monk and the Philosopher, is now a best-selling author in France. He's sort of, I suppose you could say, France's most popular Buddhist, as it were. But he also has considerable experience in experimental design, and he's working here with Richie Davidson, who's just taking him out of the fMRI after 3 hours in the magnet. And as Richie often says, it's surprising to see such a smile on his face after 3 hours in an fMRI magnet. And they have been two of the most important scientists, and I'll call them mature scientists in this context, for moving this project forward. Here we see Mathieu with a dense EEG array as he's preparing to go through some of the trials. Here we see one of the Tibetan practitioners preparing to go through one of the trials. And here are the results that were published in PNAS, the first paper published from the ADEPT study. There has been since 2 other papers published, and a third and a fourth, I think, on the way. Excuse me, a fourth and a fifth, I believe, on the way. I'll just speak very briefly about this paper. As you can see, this paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is simply about the fact that there was a very high amplitude signal detected, a synchronous signal detected in a certain meditative state. When these adepts engaged in that state, the signal appeared. Here I have, I've put up, for the sake of my very few scientific colleagues in the audience, one of the charts from the PNAS article. If you ask me exactly what it means, I couldn't tell you, to be perfectly honest. What I can say is that you can see relatively easily that the various colored lines tracking the different adepts indicate a very high degree of change in the microvoltage, as well as a very high percentage change. And on top you see some of the data from the electrodes. The implication, this is from my colleague Antoine Lutz. If we look at this slide, it's a little easier from a layman's point of view to see some of the results. First of all, what we have, if I can get, what we have here are results from 8 of the adepts. And these are percentage changes in the amplitude of this particular signal in the gamma band. And the changes compared to the controls are really quite profound. And you have one adept, for example, who had very high degree of change in the signal coming out of these set of electrodes. If we look at this graph, we can then see that of particular interest is that there's already a change at the baseline between the adepts and the controls, and that change in baseline actually rises as the adepts engage in blocks of meditation. This was a block design in which they meditated for 3 minutes and then stopped. And then, of course, in the actual meditative state, you can see that they exhibited, in terms of percentage of change of this signal, a much higher percentage of change. The controls were virtually flat. Now, part of the implication of this type of a study is that, first of all, there is a very profound degree of synchrony that's occurring locally under these electrodes, but also that seems to be sustained by some very long-distance synchrony as well. So the adepts seem to be entering a state with a particularly high degree of coherence and obviously a very strong electrical signal, relatively speaking. At the same time, what's of great interest to me, which I have not actually had a chance to discuss with my colleagues, is that this state is different from a very similar state that the adepts produce in another set of blocks. That other state is called open presence. Now, this is described in the article that I co-authored with Lutz, Davidson, and Slaughter in 2008, I believe, in Trends in Cognitive Science, in which we described some of the states on which meditation studies have been performed. An open presence state is, roughly speaking, a type of objectless background awareness that is similar to states cultivated in mindfulness practice, for example. When that state is mixed with a deliberate invocation of compassion, but without an object here, because open presence is not meant to have any explicit or selected object of the state, when that state is actually mixed with compassion, we then see this very high signal. The signal of this kind does not occur without mixing it with a deliberate invocation of compassion. To my mind, what this suggests is that a lot of the power of these contemplative states, even phenomenally, and this also matches phenomenal reports, comes from the affective features of the state. And I will show this slide, which is part of a poster that was done by Dr. Lutz. I won't get into the details because Dr. Lutz hasn't published this material yet and would prefer that I not get into the details. But I will just simply mention that this partially then inspired the notion of taking a particular measure of the phenomenal quality of the state, called in Tibetan selcha, or we could translate this as clarity or even intensity. And what this means is the degree to which the state itself involves a kind of luminosity, actually. Intensity in the sense of luminosity. And then tracking that with a first-person report. There are going to be lots of problems, even with the study published in PNAS, with the possibility of what are called muscle artifacts in EEG signatures, where muscular motions may produce a false EEG signal. But there's a very strong indication that the amplitude of the EEG signal really has a very high degree of correlation with the first-person report that we see in the adepts. And this would be quite a stunning result, to see that the adept's first-person report actually tracks a particular feature of an EEG signal. Again, I should add that this is an EEG signal that is recording the EEG signal here, the way in which this data is being processed is in terms of a distributed array of neurons. That's the way it's being interpreted, I should say. So there are, of course, other interpretations, some of them involving emotional effects, some of them involving, interestingly, immune and endocrine function effects. And I'd point, for example, to a study that was published here with Thaddeus Pace as the lead author and Chuck Raison as the final author on the effects of compassion meditation. But so far, these types of, this particular notion that the phenomenal reports of the state can in some way track features that are detectable in some form of neuroimaging still remain largely unstudied. This possibility still remains largely unstudied. For me, an important feature of this is a larger issue that I'm interested in, which is the notion of simulation. Now, a large number of cognitive scientists think that the way in which we think, I'm not sure if I should say a large number, there's a certain number, some of them well represented at Emory, who think that simulation is crucial to the way in which we think. And for me, simulation is one way of getting my mind around this question that we see on the screen. How can religious or quasi-religious contexts inculcate beliefs, especially those that motivate action, which are not explicable through innate features of human cognition? We can use the notion of the hyperactive agent detection device, I think, if I got that right, that has already been mentioned, that Dr. Barrett has discussed in his work, as a way of looking at innate features of human cognition, which might explain certain types of religious beliefs. But we know that there are lots of religious beliefs out there that do not seem really to track very well innate features of human cognition. And yet these are also beliefs that can motivate human activity. Some of that human activity can be quite violent. A question then would be, how can these beliefs become so powerful that they might not only override some innate features of human cognition, but they might even override what we would think as being many of our social norms? Well, one way of thinking about this is that the effective impact of experiences also has a kind of effect on cognition in which the possibilities of cognition are limited. In other words, what is thinkable and what is unthinkable, what we can simulate and what we cannot simulate, is in some fashion limited by the cognitive, in other words, the cognitive frames that we use to run simulations are limited by the downward causal effect of the types of conscious states. The coherence of those conscious states is given with their effective force, and they then are recruited into certain types of cognitive schemas. I realize that this is very speculative. It's not something that's going to be answered in the next decade or even the next two. But it may propose some interesting possibilities for a research program. Certainly for me, it becomes important to understand for religious traditions not simply what is innately thinkable or unthinkable, but what can be in a plastic manner thinkable or unthinkable. How can religious traditions actually change the way in which we cognize our world? The model that I hope to use and that I'm working on currently is the model of conceptual blending used by Fauconnier and Turner, or developed by Fauconnier and Turner, and their somewhat grandiosely titled work, The Way We Think. Thanks very much. Oh, and also thanks to Evan Townsend and Dunne.